People, what deep, dark secret did you learn about the seemingly perfect family? I grew up with a family who were well-liked and popular in our small town. The parents had been a fixture in the community since high school, known for being friendly, positive, and non-confrontational. They never seemed to have strong opinions or engage in arguments, which made them the kind of people others naturally gravitated toward. Their daughters were just as popular and well-liked, with everyone drawn to their charm and easygoing nature. The family owned a local dealership, and the girls frequently appeared in commercials for it. Everyone seemed to adore them because they always exuded an air of kindness, and honestly, no one ever suspected anything out of the ordinary. One day, when I was in high school, one of their daughters, who was in my grade, casually mentioned something to me. We were chatting, and she mentioned that she had found a hidden camera in the pool changing room at their pool house. She said it nonchalantly, as if it was a funny little discovery. She laughed it off and said, "Oh, my dad is so silly for putting a camera there, like it was no big deal." At first, I thought she was just assuming it was there to catch the kids drinking or sneaking around, a typical concern for a parent who wanted to keep an eye on things. But the more I thought about it, I realized there was something off about her reaction. She didn't seem shocked or worried, just kind of shrugged it off like it wasn't that serious. Over time, it became clear that she might have figured out there was more to it than just her dad trying to catch them doing something naughty. But instead of confronting the reality, she seemed to accept it with a boys will be boys kind of mentality. She didn't seem to fully comprehend how wrong it actually was, which made the situation even more disturbing. Her father had always given off a weird vibe, like he was overly friendly in a way that didn't sit right with me. As the pieces started to fall together, it became harder to ignore the unsettling possibility that he had been secretly recording not just his daughters, but all of their friends too. Nearly every popular high school girl in town. His creepy behavior and the hidden camera in the pool house pointed to something much darker than anyone had ever imagined. It made me question how much we really knew about the people we thought we could trust, and how much of their perfect public image was just a facade. Story 2. I know a family that, while incredibly wealthy and in charge of running a major company branch, held some deeply troubling views and practices. They didn't own the company, but their influence was significant. One of the first things they told me was that they only hired a very specific group of people, namely, individuals who were British, white, and heterosexual. They outright stated that they didn't believe women should hold high-paying roles, as they didn't think they were deserving of such positions. Additionally, they insisted that women shouldn't work in office roles, which were considered too easy for them, and instead should be in roles like kitchen work. Their logic was that women were too delicate for anything else, including outdoor labor. The family had more secrets than I could ever have imagined. One of the most disturbing things was the significant age gap between the father and his second wife. The way she behaved around him was unsettling, and it was as though she was constantly terrified of him. She would ask his permission for even the smallest decisions, showing a clear imbalance in their relationship. The father, who held some appalling beliefs, thought that people who were poor deserved to stay that way. Despite being aware of the systemic issues that led to poverty, he believed that there always had to be a group of people at the bottom, and that it was necessary to keep them there. He even thought it was their fault for being born into poverty, and that their children should suffer the same fate. This man had left his first wife after cheating on her with his second wife, abandoning not only her, but also their young children, who were as young as 2 years old. What's worse is that he would constantly talk about how much he hated his children, calling them disappointments, even though he hadn't had contact with them in years. To him, a 2-year-old child was a disappointment, which is absolutely incomprehensible. His ex-wife ended up in poverty, while he somehow avoided paying any child support. The children and teenagers in this family were deeply affected by their upbringing. Many of them had experienced traumatic abuse that had been covered up, and others struggled with severe mental health issues. Some were anorexic, while others exhibited cruel, harmful behaviors, walking in their parents' footsteps and embodying all of their worst traits. They were homophobic, sexist, racist, and hateful, with some even displaying sociopathic tendencies. One of the younger family members caused such harm to his ex-partner that she is now unable to have children, though I'm unsure of the exact details of what happened. I came to know some of this family through my close friendship with one of the teenagers during my secondary school years. I spent a fair amount of time at their mansion, and it was clear that when they drank, they often let things slip. My friend, who was openly gay, had 3 beards girlfriends he used to hide his sexuality, because he was constantly in denial about his own identity, despite his deep-seated hatred of gay people. His inner conflict was heartbreaking to witness. It's tragic how much damage this family's toxic beliefs and behaviors have caused, not just to them but to everyone around them. Story 3. The mother remarried when her children were still quite young, and her new husband seemed like the ideal stepfather. He was kind, attentive, and fit seamlessly into their family dynamic. Years passed, and by the time the daughter was 18, everything seemed to be going well. However, one day while she was in the bathroom taking a shower, she noticed something strange. Upon closer inspection, she discovered a hidden webcam, which she soon realized had been secretly placed by her stepfather. While this discovery was deeply unsettling, what followed was even more shocking. The mother, instead of taking immediate action to protect her daughter, chose to forgive her husband for his actions. She told her daughter that, no matter the circumstances, she would always put her husband first. As if this wasn't painful enough, the mother arranged for her daughter to move in with her grandmother, effectively distancing her from the situation and, in the daughter's eyes, from the mother's support as well. What made this situation even more tragic was the betrayal by both parents. The stepfather's actions were egregious, but the mother's response was equally devastating. Instead of offering comfort, justice, or even empathy, she chose to defend the person who violated her own child's privacy and trust. It was a heartbreaking moment that left the daughter feeling abandoned and lost, facing not only the trauma of what had occurred, but also the painful realization that her own mother had failed to protect her. Story 4. When I was younger, I had a set of twins as friends through my older sister. The twins, both female, were high-achieving students and always dressed very conservatively. Their parents were strict and didn't allow them to date. They lived in a large, beautiful home and had multiple cars. It always seemed like the girls had everything they could possibly need or want. A few years later, something shocking came to light. It was revealed that the parents owned another property just a few streets away, which was much less extravagant. What was even more surprising was that this house was being used for illegal activities, with young women of the same age as their daughters being exploited. By this time, the twins were around 18 and in university. I couldn't help but find it deeply ironic and troubling that their parents, who had been so protective of their own daughters, were involved in such activities that harmed other young women, some even the same age as their own children. Story 5. My family seemed perfect when I was younger, or at least that's how it appeared to me. Things stayed smooth until I was 13, and my parents got divorced. Both of them assured me that it wasn't anyone's fault, but it turned out that, while I wasn't the reason for the split, I was the catalyst for it all unraveling. As I got older, my dad began to notice that I didn't look like him physically. It started to bother him more as time went on, so one day he confronted my mom. That's when she revealed the truth. I wasn't his biological son. I was the product of a one-night stand. My mom and dad had briefly dated, then broke up. After the breakup, she went to a party, met someone, and ended up sleeping with him. When she found out she was pregnant, she told my dad I was his child, and they got married shortly after I was born. At first, my dad agreed that no one else needed to know the truth. But once he found out, it put the entire foundation of their marriage in question. The lies began to unravel, and it only brought more tension between them. They decided to divorce, which was the beginning of the end of my perfect family. In the years since, a lot of dark things came to light, things that poisoned almost all the good memories I had from my childhood. Edit. After the divorce, my dad vanished from mine and my sister's lives for about a year. When he came back, he had a new girlfriend who was already pregnant. From the time I was 14 until I joined the Air Force, I still had a relationship with him, but it was rocky and complicated. At first, I blamed both him and my mom for the divorce, but I eventually came around. By the time I left for the Air Force, we were close again, thick as thieves. Then I got married, and things took another turn. My dad didn't approve of my wife, and we started arguing bitterly. One day, I pushed things a little too far, and my dad reached out to my mom. He demanded that she tell me the truth about my paternity, or he would. At 21, I found out the truth, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. It actually brought me closer to my dad and made me resent my mom for a while. After that, my dad went through another divorce, this time from his second wife. Things started to fall apart between us once again. He became a bitter alcoholic, and because of unpaid child support, he couldn't attend any major life events for me or my siblings. It got to a point where I haven't spoken to him in 2 years because dealing with his drama just wasn't worth it anymore. Despite everything, I still consider him my dad. I eventually had a heart-to-heart with my mom, and we healed our relationship. The one thing that hasn't been resolved is the truth about my biological father. My mom insists she doesn't know who the man is, but several people in the family have told me she does. I haven't pushed the issue, though. Edit 2. The unpaid child support is mainly for my 2 sisters, who are definitely his biological children. Story 6. I know a brother and sister who live together in a large mansion and both own beautiful, high-end cars. They come across as very wealthy and well-off, and they clearly enjoy a life of luxury. At one point, one of them started dating a family friend who wasn't as affluent, which seemed a bit out of place compared to their usual circle. As time went on, I learned that the reason the siblings had such immense wealth was tied to a tragic and horrifying past. Their parents had been involved with a notorious crime organization, and when the siblings were young, their parents were violently killed in front of them. This traumatic event left them with a significant inheritance, which was the source of their considerable wealth. Despite their tragic backstory, the siblings presented themselves as if they had lived lives of ease and comfort, with no hint of the dark history that had shaped their present. It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes people who've endured unimaginable hardship seem to have the most effortless lives. Edit. Since everyone's asking, the mother was essayed then murdered while her husband watched, then the husband was murdered. Story 7. My next-door neighbors, a couple with 2 young daughters, and the family down the road, another couple with 3 young daughters, were very close and spent a lot of time together. They would go on trips, dine out, and even bought a vacation property together. When my family had to relocate to another state for 2 years, our house didn't sell due to the housing crash of 2008, so we ended up moving back in. While preparing to move back, we found a book in a bathroom drawer and a strange stain on the carpet. We had given our neighbors a spare key in case they needed to store things or take shelter during a hurricane. We live in Florida. We just assumed it was a careless mistake by someone using our home while we were gone. After a few months of settling back in, our next-door neighbors moved out abruptly, even leaving behind their cat. We later discovered that the husband from next door and the wife from down the road had been having an affair, using our house as a meeting spot and monitoring their children with baby monitors. Once we returned, the couple had to start taking business trips, but eventually got caught. The wife of the neighbors next door was willing to forgive her husband, but didn't want to stay in the same neighborhood as the other woman. The husband down the road, who was quite intimidating, made threats toward them. In the end, we ended up keeping the cat, and he was a wonderful companion until he passed away a few years later. Story 8. My grandfather, on my mom's side, had a secret. He had another family that no one knew about. He kept it hidden for years, and it wasn't until his passing that the truth began to unravel. When he died, my grandmother's name was placed on his gravestone, as you'd expect. But what happened afterward was something I could never have predicted. The other family, who had been kept in the shadows for so long, came forward and had my grandmother's name chiseled off the gravestone. It was a strange and painful moment for our family, as if all the years of secrecy and lies were being carried out in the most public way. On top of that, I discovered something else about my family when I was 23. My oldest aunt, who had always been a part of our lives and who I had always thought of as my blood relative, actually wasn't related to us by blood at all. It was a revelation that shook me, as I had never even suspected that the family dynamic I knew could be different. This knowledge added another layer of complexity to my understanding of my family, and I couldn't help but feel betrayed by the secrets that had been kept from me for so long. It was as if the foundations of my family had been built on hidden truths, and suddenly, everything felt a little less certain. Story 9. The family had a son who was born with severe disabilities, and they kept him locked away from the world. Most people didn't even know he existed, as his parents went at great lengths to keep him hidden. His room was essentially transformed into a padded cell, designed to keep him confined and isolated from the rest of the household. He was rarely allowed to leave his bed, with his only interactions being with a nurse who came regularly to bathe him, feed him, and help rotate him to avoid bed sores. The most heartbreaking part was the emotional distance his parents kept from him. They hardly ever spoke to him, let alone looked at him. His existence seemed to be something they wanted to ignore, almost as though he was an inconvenience to their lives. There was no love, no nurturing, just a routine of neglect and isolation. It was as if he was a ghost in his own home, existing but not truly living. It was a tragic and disturbing situation, one that most people around them would never even imagine could happen behind closed doors. Story 10. My grandfather lives alone in Tennessee, tucked away in the mountains, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. His property is quite secluded, with thick trees surrounding most of it, giving it an almost eerie sense of solitude. One of the more unusual features of his land is a small family cemetery located in his backyard. To get there, you have to walk up a 50-yard-long hill, shrouded in dense forest, which gives the whole place a mysterious, almost forgotten feeling. In this cemetery lies the grave of a man from our family, along with the graves of his 9 children and 4 wives, all of whom passed away at young ages. What makes the story even more chilling is that all of his wives died just a few years after they married him, around 3 to 5 years after their weddings. This happened back in the mid to late 1800s, and the man was reportedly known to be a rather shady character. People in the area often whispered about him, though no one could say for sure what caused so much tragedy in his life. To this day, it's still a mystery whether he played a role in the deaths of his wives and children, or if he was simply an incredibly unlucky man who lost everyone close to him in such a short span of time. The combination of the family's tragic history and the unsettling location of the cemetery adds to the sense of intrigue surrounding this old story. It's one of those family legends that people still talk about, but no one really knows the truth behind it. Story 11. I worked at an Amazon store for a while, and one day the owner hired a new employee, this kid whose parents went to his church. On the day he was supposed to start, the whole family showed up, the mom, dad, and son. To my surprise, they all started working. The owner, who was a bit of a pushover, didn't have the guts to tell them no, so he ended up hiring all 3 of them. They quickly became the bottom-of-the-barrel workers. They mostly kept to themselves, exchanging only pleasantries with the rest of us. The rest of us were a pretty rowdy bunch, so they definitely didn't fit in. Plus, they didn't contribute much to the workload. It felt like 3 of them could barely do the work of one. My coworker, noticing how off they seemed, started calling them the Dahmer family because the father resembled Jeffrey Dahmer, and they all had this unsettlingly perfect, overly Christian vibe about them. Then things started getting even weirder. The son would regularly call out of work, claiming stomach problems or saying that certain tasks made his legs tired, excuses that didn't seem to hold much water. Meanwhile, Mr. Dahmer began having these intense fits of rage, getting incredibly angry over minor things. It was unsettling, and we never quite knew what would set him off. Mrs. Dahmer started acting strange too. She became unnervingly attached to me. She would give me odd gifts like holistic headache creams, organic teas, and even a neti pot, which I thought was bizarre at the time but didn't think much of it. Years later, I found out some disturbing things. The son had AIDS, and it turned out his mother and he were a little too close for comfort, perhaps even a bit too much so for a mother and son. Eventually, Mr. Dahmer got caught doing some suspicious activities, and the couple got a divorce. But the oddness didn't stop there. In my last week at the store, Mrs. Dahmer started asking me strange questions about demons and spiritual matters, and I could feel her slipping further into a strange mindset. On my last day, she gave me a manila envelope, and inside was a 30-page manifesto, a letter she had written to me, claiming she was infested with demons and filled with all sorts of bizarre references to the Song of Solomon and other cryptic spiritual thoughts. She even said that she thought I was infested with demons as well. Despite everything that happened, I still have that neti pot she gave me. It's a strange memento from one of the oddest experiences of my life. Story 12. I had the chance to meet my friend's grandparents, and at first glance, they seemed like the epitome of what you'd expect from your typical, sweet, older American couple. They had the quaintest little house, filled with charming vintage touches, doilies on almost every surface, and an overall cozy, welcoming vibe. They were incredibly warm and friendly, the kind of people who immediately make you feel at home. But as I got to know them a bit more, I learned something that completely surprised me. For a time during the 60s or 70s, they had been involved in a rather unconventional lifestyle. It turns out they were part of a communal group that was known for their free-spirited and non-traditional beliefs, and it was later revealed that they had spent time in a cult-like environment. It was something of an open secret within the family, but it was still shocking to hear. To make matters even more intriguing, it turned out that my friend's uncle, who I had always known as just a regular, down-to-earth guy, was actually the biological child of my friend's grandmother and the cult leader. It was a revelation that seemed out of place, considering how innocent and wholesome their family seemed on the surface. The way the family had handled it all over the years, with a sense of quiet acknowledgement rather than shame or scandal, made it even more surreal. Despite the unusual and unconventional past they had, the grandparents were still the same warm, kind-hearted people I had first met. It was a strange and unexpected layer to their otherwise peaceful and loving lives. Story 13. This family seemed like the epitome of perfection. They had the perfect kids, a loving husband and wife, and were respected members of the community. The dad, a well-known and respected doctor, had partnered with another highly regarded doctor in town, and the two were seen as pillars of the community. They had built a successful practice together, and everything appeared to be ideal. A few years later, a polite notice appeared in the local newspaper, announcing that the two doctors were ending their professional partnership. It was very matter of fact, with no explanation beyond that. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Life carried on, and it seemed like business as usual. The family continued to live their lives, and the small town didn't raise any questions. Fast forward about 20 years, and I came across one of the daughters on Facebook. We had gone to school together, and since I had been a patient of her dad's back in the day, I sent her a message asking how he was doing. That's when she shared something that completely blew me away. Her father had become estranged from the family. The practice he had shared with his former partner? It turned out that he had been having an affair with the partner's wife, and the two of them had run off together. The real reason for the split between the two doctors had nothing to do with any professional differences, but to maintain appearances, they had made it look like a simple and amicable business decision. To save face and avoid scandal, the whole affair was kept quiet, and he retired soon after, allowing everyone to think that it was a professional end to their partnership. Very few people knew the truth behind it all. Most were still under the impression that everything had been just as it appeared on the surface. I was floored by the revelation. This secret had been hidden for so long, and it was shocking to find out how much of it had been swept under the rug. It was a reminder that appearances can be incredibly deceiving, and even the most perfect-seeming families can have skeletons in their closets. Story 14. I come from a very small family. There are only about 7 of us. Growing up, I remember everyone getting together for holidays and special events, and everything seemed pretty normal. It looked like we all got along, with no real drama or tension. It wasn't until I became a teenager that I started noticing something strange. Over time, I realized that everyone in my family actually despised each other. What I had assumed were simple disagreements were, in fact, ongoing rivalries, with each person seemingly trying to outdo the other in some contest to see who had become the better person over the years. As I got older, I saw the true nature of these relationships. The only people who really talk to each other now are my mother and grandmother, and even then, I'm sure it's more out of necessity since they live together. My grandmother and grandfather are separated, but she only calls him every few months, not out of any real concern, but just to check if he's still alive or not. It's almost as if she's keeping a distant record of his existence, more out of routine than anything else. It's become clear that what appeared to be a close-knit family growing up was actually a group of people who had grown increasingly disconnected, each holding on to their own grudges and trying to prove their superiority to the others. It's a strange and uncomfortable realization, knowing that the family togetherness I once took for granted was really just a facade. Story 15. I learned more about my family after my great-grandfather passed away than I had ever known before. My mom's side of the family comes from a small coal mining town in West Virginia. After my great-grandfather's death, I discovered some surprising truths about my ancestors. It turns out that my great-grandmother wasn't actually my great-grandmother at all. She was my great-great-aunt, my great-grandmother's sister. It's all a bit confusing with the once-removed term, but the real story behind my great-grandmother was even more shocking. My real great-grandmother was a prostitute who had many children with different men. Because she was deemed unfit to care for my grandfather, my great-grandfather, John, ended up living with her sister, Rosie. Rosie was an alcoholic, and it was not uncommon for her to drink herself into such a stupor that ambulances were called to pump her stomach. But when the medical staff would arrive, she'd shoot at them with a revolver to try to make them leave. Unfortunately, Rosie's behavior didn't stop there. She was also having an affair with a man who worked at the coal mine with my great-grandfather. John was a well-respected man in the community, and I've never heard a bad word spoken about him. One day, he went to the man who had been involved with Rosie and calmly said, "I'm a good Christian man and I forgive you, but if I ever see you at my house, you're a dead man." 2 weeks later, when John found the man at his house, he used his revolver on him. Back in those days in West Virginia, it was considered a justifiable homicide, so John went to jail for 2 years. While John was incarcerated, the oldest son, my grandfather, was only 14 years old. With no money coming into the family, my grandfather lied about his age so he could work at the coal mine. He dropped out of school after the 8th grade and began working as a blaster on his first day. On the other side, my grandmother was born in Jersey, and her mother passed away when she was just 7. Left in the care of an alcoholic, ineffective father, my grandmother was placed in foster homes, which were often neglectful or abusive. Sometimes she was beaten or locked in a dark closet under the stairs for misbehaving, in a situation straight out of a Harry Potter story. At 15, she ran away with a friend and ended up in that small West Virginia town. There, she found work serving tables, and one day met my 14-year-old grandfather, who was drinking beer after lying about his age. The two of them have been together ever since. Now, at 78 and 79, They live in a $1 million home near DC, with a lifetime of wild stories behind them. It's fascinating to think about how small decisions, made generations ago, can create ripples that echo throughout the years and affect the course of history. Story 16. On my mother's side of the family, I have an aunt who did something truly shocking. There was a small, tight-knit town charity that was raising money to help rebuild the house of a man whose home had burned down. The town didn't have a lot of resources, so they set up a simple donation system. Just a bin for dollar bills at the local bar. People would toss in whatever they could spare, and it was a communal effort to help someone in need. But my aunt, for reasons I still can't understand, decided to steal the entire contents of that bin. The very next day, she showed up with a new pair of expensive shoes, like nothing had happened. It was almost as if she didn't care about the damage she'd caused, even though it was meant to help a person who had already lost so much. The audacity of it still blows my mind. People in the town loved the idea of helping others, and she took advantage of their generosity for something as trivial as a pair of designer shoes. Then on my dad's side, there's my grandfather, who was something of a legend, but not for the reasons most people would consider admirable. He had the kind of face you'd expect from a con artist, all weaselly and untrustworthy. He had a reputation for swindling just about anyone he could find: churches, celebrities, and even politicians. He knew how to charm people and manipulate situations. Also, he could live a life of luxury without ever working for it. He'd play the system and use his silver tongue to get whatever he wanted. But one day, he disappeared without a trace, along with what was reportedly one of the largest collections of sports memorabilia in the world. People assumed he had pulled off another one of his schemes, but the truth came out eventually. He'd been the target of a mob hit. The same people he had conned along the way finally got their revenge. And just like that, he vanished from the world he'd manipulated for so long. It's strange, when you look back at the people in your family and realize how far some of them are willing to go. On one side, a relative steals from a charity for a personal gain as petty as new shoes, while on the other, a grandfather lives a life of fraud until it catches up with him in the most dramatic way possible. It's almost like a lesson in how unchecked greed and deception can lead to very different kinds of downfalls. Story 17. This story isn't about my own family, but I have to share it because it's just so wild. It's been about 2 years since everything came out, and they're more comfortable talking and joking about it now, though I never really asked about the aftermath. I know these two sisters who seemed like a pretty typical family. Sure, they had their share of family issues, but for the most part, they got along with each other. Their dad, though, was a bit of an enigma. He worked a lot and went on business trips often. What struck people as odd was that he was a chef, or at least that's what he said, or he worked in a kitchen of some kind. It didn't seem to quite add up for someone who was constantly traveling, especially considering that his job didn't really require all those trips. But the sisters never thought much of it, and they just assumed it was all normal. Well, it turns out the dad had been leading a double life. The family they knew was actually his second family, and he had another wife and kids. The other family had 2 older brothers, both of whom were older than the sisters. They eventually discovered that he had been putting 3 out of 4 of his kids through college, and the 4th was currently enrolled. The sisters had no idea about any of this until the other wife, the mother of the first family, started poking around online. One day, while snooping through Facebook, she found a picture of her husband with the girl's mom. Furious, she sent a death threat to the sister's mom, and that's when everything fell apart. The truth slowly came out, and the sisters pieced everything together from there. It was honestly one of the most jaw-dropping things I've ever heard. I wasn't even directly involved, but the sheer shock of the whole situation was almost too much to process. Imagine living your whole life thinking everything is one way, only to find out your dad had been secretly leading a completely different life with another family. Even now, I can't quite wrap my head around it. Story 18. It's not the worst secret in the world, but it's one that definitely caught me by surprise. My mother still keeps in touch with her first boyfriend, and for as long as I can remember, I've known them to have a somewhat cordial relationship. The family of her ex seemed like the picture-perfect family to anyone who looked in from the outside. They were always so polite, welcoming, and everyone seemed to get along without any issues. From what I knew for the last 35 years, they appeared to live a normal, happy life. It wasn't until recently that I learned a darker truth about this family. The woman my mother's ex married wasn't the loving, nurturing stepmother you might expect. In reality, she had a history of abuse. She physically mistreated the children, and this continued until they were 18 years old. Both daughters had grown up in a toxic and violent environment, and it turned out that they couldn't stand each other. Despite this, they both kept up appearances, and whenever they were out in public, They would put on the facade of a perfectly functional, harmonious family. They pretended to get along, acting as if everything was fine and they were one big happy unit. To be honest, it's not shocking when you think about it. Sadly, many families have dark secrets hidden beneath the surface, but it's still crazy to me considering how well this family has managed to present themselves in public all these years. To see how polite and perfect they looked, it's hard to believe that there was so much dysfunction and resentment behind closed doors. The stark contrast between how they appeared and what was actually going on was truly eye-opening. It just goes to show that you never really know what's happening in someone else's life, no matter how well they may present themselves to the world. Story 19. My grandmother recently passed away, and on her deathbed, she shared with my mother a series of revelations, things that had been buried for generations. Some of the secrets my mother had already known, but most of them were completely unknown to me. The stories were deeply disturbing and unsettling. Among the revelations were allegations of severe family trauma, including inappropriate behavior, abuse, and even the possibility of a tragic loss of life. One of my great-uncles had a troubling reputation for mistreating young girls and had even attempted to harm my mother when she was young. Thankfully, she was quick-thinking enough to escape and inform her parents. There's also a chilling suspicion that he may have been involved in a death, though the details remain unclear. Additionally, I learned that one of my aunts might have a very different biological father than she thought. Her uncle may actually be her father. There were also patterns of excessive drinking and addiction within the family, along with multiple instances of unfaithfulness. I had always known these relatives as respectable, upstanding individuals, often presenting themselves as devout Christians. They attended church regularly and held themselves to moral standards that, on the surface, seemed admirable. But the reality behind their outward appearance was far more complicated. It's strange to realize that the people who were most likely to pass judgment on others were the ones who were most closely tied to these hidden family secrets. To add to the list of shocking revelations, I also discovered that my great-grandparents were extremely harsh in their discipline. Apparently, they would punish their children daily for minor accidents, like wetting the bed. My great-grandfather's responsibility first thing in the morning was to check which of the children had wet the bed and administer punishment for it. The cruelty of this is difficult to comprehend, as if children could somehow control such things just to avoid the punishment. My great-grandmother was no less harsh. She had a cane that she would use to trip the children, and if anyone crossed in front of her TV while she was watching her shows, she would use it to strike them across the neck. It's shocking that no one was seriously injured by her actions. Learning all of this has been a sobering experience, revealing the stark contrast between the family I thought I knew and the hidden history that now defines so much of who they were. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.